David left work a little later than usual and stopped at the neighborhood grocery store, following the same Thursday routine he had repeated for years. Nothing about the evening felt different because he wasn't planning to buy anything unusual. He walked through the familiar aisles, picked up the same everyday items, and reached the checkout without thinking much about any of his choices. Everything felt so automatic that he barely remembered placing most of the products into his basket. While waiting in line, David glanced at the basket and quietly wondered why almost every item looked strangely familiar. It felt less like he had made today's choices and more like he was repeating someone else's list. Curious, he opened the Notes app on his phone, where he kept last week's grocery list, and compared it with today's basket. The lists matched almost perfectly, even though he couldn't remember deciding to buy the same things again. For a moment, David tried recalling why he had chosen each item, but he couldn't explain most of them because they no longer felt like decisions. Walking out of the store, he realized something ordinary had quietly become invisible, and he couldn't stop wondering how long it had been happening. Welcome to Lion Invests. This channel isn't about getting rich overnight. It's about understanding why we make the financial decisions we do. Because once you understand the pattern, everything starts to make more sense. If that's the kind of thinking you're interested in, I'd love to have you subscribe. Now let's get back to the story. The drive home felt unusually quiet because David wasn't thinking about groceries anymore. He was thinking about how many everyday choices he could no longer remember actually making. After putting everything away, he opened several months of bank statements beside his grocery receipts, not because he expected a mistake, but because he wanted to understand the routine. For the first time, he looked for repetition instead of individual purchases. Nothing seemed expensive, reckless, or unusual because every transaction looked completely reasonable on its own. The strange feeling only appeared when the same ordinary choices kept returning month after month. I know what you're thinking because David thought exactly the same thing. How could something so ordinary possibly matter that much? The question stayed with him because no single purchase explained the feeling. Instead, the pattern only became visible after dozens of ordinary decisions were viewed together. That's when David realized he hadn't discovered a spending problem. He had discovered a repetition problem. Most financial habits don't begin with dramatic decisions because daily life is rarely dramatic. They begin when familiar choices become so comfortable that they stop feeling like choices at all. The hidden cycle that drains money each month isn't usually hidden by complicated mathematics or confusing financial products. It's hidden by ordinary routines repeated often enough that the brain stops paying attention. That changes the question completely, because the real issue isn't whether a purchase is good or bad. It's whether you still notice yourself making it. Here's the strange part, because this happens regardless of income. Higher earners and lower earners can both become trapped by repeated behavior that gradually disappears from conscious awareness. Behavioral economists explain that repeated actions require less mental effort over time because the brain naturally automates familiar routines. That efficiency makes life easier while quietly reducing conscious attention. Imagine walking the same path through a field every morning until the grass bends beneath your feet. Eventually, you stop noticing the path because it simply becomes the way you always walk. Financial routines follow a remarkably similar pattern because repetition creates familiarity, while familiarity slowly reduces awareness. The behavior continues even after the thinking behind it has disappeared. Stay with me because this isn't about blaming yourself for buying coffee, eating out, or enjoying life. The more interesting question is why repeated spending becomes almost invisible to the person making it. Researchers studying behavioral economics consistently find that people examine unfamiliar expenses much more carefully than familiar ones. Because novelty naturally captures attention while repetition quietly blends into the background. The mind protects effort by reducing awareness. That explains why an unexpected repair bill feels memorable, while recurring subscriptions, convenience purchases, and routine upgrades often pass almost unnoticed. The surprise stands out while the pattern quietly continues. Instead of asking where your money disappeared, consider asking which expenses stopped feeling like decisions altogether. That single question often reveals the cycle far more clearly than any budget ever could. David closed the last bank statement and realized the grocery store had never been the real story. It was simply the ordinary moment that finally exposed an invisible pattern he had been living for years. The grocery trip wasn't unusual because almost everyone follows routines without realizing how many decisions have quietly become automatic. The interesting part is what those routines slowly begin to build over time. Think about the first time you bought something new because you probably considered the price, compared alternatives, and questioned whether you really needed it. Months later, that same purchase may happen almost without conscious thought. That shift from deliberate choice to automatic behavior is one of the brain's most useful abilities because it saves mental effort for more important decisions. The same shortcut that makes life easier can also make recurring costs harder to notice. Here's where things begin to change because the problem isn't usually one expensive purchase. It's dozens of ordinary purchases that gradually stop competing for your attention. Imagine placing one book onto a shelf every week because each edition feels insignificant by itself. Years later, the shelf is full even though no single moment ever felt important. Money often follows that same quiet rhythm because repeated expenses accumulate long before they attract curiosity. By the time they become noticeable, they've usually become part of everyday life. Behavioral economists sometimes describe this as automaticity because repeated actions require progressively less conscious attention. The behavior remains while the awareness that once guided it slowly fades. A streaming subscription renewed this morning probably didn't create much emotion because it happened exactly as expected. The brain treats predictable events differently from unexpected ones. The same can be true for convenience purchases, delivery fees, digital services, and small upgrades that quietly blend into normal life. Each one may seem reasonable while viewed on its own. I thought the same thing for a long time because none of these examples sound particularly serious. The deeper question isn't whether they're reasonable, but whether you've stopped noticing them altogether. Once awareness disappears, comparison often disappears with it because habits rarely invite fresh evaluation. They simply continue following yesterday's instructions. This helps explain why many people feel their financial situation changes without remembering exactly when it happened. The transition is usually gradual rather than dramatic. Consider a recurring expense of $15 each week because that amount rarely changes anyone's plans today. After many months, the total becomes much larger than any individual purchase ever suggested. The mathematics aren't surprising because addition is simple. What's surprising is how easily the human mind separates individual moments from their cumulative outcome. Give me a minute because this distinction matters more than it first appears. Understanding accumulation is often easier than recognizing repetition while it's still happening. History offers similar examples because large systems often change through countless small adjustments instead of one dramatic event. The final outcome receives attention while the gradual process is quietly forgotten. Personal finances frequently behave the same way because habits shape direction long before they noticeably shape results. The pattern becomes visible only after enough time has passed. That doesn't mean every recurring expense is a mistake, because many provide genuine value and improve daily life. The important question is whether each one still reflects an intentional decision. Intentional spending and automatic spending can sometimes look identical on a bank statement. The difference exists inside awareness rather than inside the transaction itself. Most people never pause to ask when a routine quietly became permanent because familiarity rarely feels urgent. Comfort often disguises repetition. Once a behavior enters the background of everyday life, it can continue for months or even years without attracting serious reflection. Not because anyone lacks discipline, but because attention naturally moves elsewhere. This is where behavioral psychology becomes especially useful because it explains ordinary human behavior rather than personal failure. The brain is designed to automate repetition whenever possible. That design saves enormous mental energy throughout daily life. Yet every advantage carries a trade-off because automated routines receive less conscious review over time. Efficiency and awareness don't always increase together. Instead of asking how to eliminate every unnecessary purchase, a more useful question asks which routines deserve another look. Small moments of awareness often reveal patterns that months of worry never could. The really important part is what happens next, because once you understand how habits quietly become invisible, you can begin exploring why those hidden cycles often grow stronger even as income increases. At first, earning more money seems like it should solve the problem because a larger paycheck creates more financial breathing room. For many people, though, the feeling of being financially stretched doesn't disappear as quickly as expected. This doesn't happen because income stopped growing. It often happens because expectations quietly grew alongside it. The hidden cycle begins changing shape because the spending itself may look different while the underlying pattern remains remarkably familiar. The routine adapts instead of disappearing. A meal that once felt like a special occasion gradually becomes an ordinary Tuesday dinner. What was once a reward slowly becomes the new normal. I know what you're thinking, because enjoying a higher standard of living isn't the problem. The important question is whether your habits are following your values or simply following your previous habits at a higher price. Economists sometimes describe this as a lifestyle inflation because increases in spending often accompany increases in income. The concept isn't about avoiding success, but about understanding how expectations naturally adjust. The human brain quickly adapts to improvements because what once felt exciting gradually becomes familiar. That adaptation helps explain why satisfaction often fades faster than expected. Imagine raising the temperature in a room by 1 degree every few weeks. Each change feels almost impossible to notice, yet the room eventually feels completely different. Financial habits often evolve with the same quiet rhythm because today's upgrade becomes tomorrow's routine. The transition is so gradual that it rarely feels like change at all. Here's the strange part, because this pattern doesn't require expensive purchases. Even modest increases repeated across many categories can reshape a monthly budget over time. A slightly newer phone, a few extra subscriptions, more frequent takeout, or upgraded conveniences may each feel perfectly reasonable. Viewed together, they tell a different story than any single purchase can. None of those choices are automatically right or wrong because value depends on individual priorities. The real question is whether each decision remains intentional after it becomes familiar. Researchers studying human behavior have long observed that people adapt surprisingly quickly to improve circumstances. Once adaptation occurs, yesterday's luxury often becomes today's expectation. That shift creates an interesting illusion because income rises while the feeling of having extra money often remains surprisingly short-lived. Expectations quietly absorb much of the increase. Stay with me because this is where many financial conversations become incomplete. People often focus on earning more while spending patterns quietly continue evolving beneath the surface. Think of a moving walkway at an airport because you're still walking forward. If the walkway begins moving backward at the same time, your progress feels much slower than expected. Rising income and rising expectations can sometimes create a similar experience. Both move together, making genuine financial progress harder to recognize. That's why two people earning the same income can experience completely different levels of financial comfort. Their habits, expectations, and recurring commitments may be moving in very different directions. The difference isn't always visible from the outside because bank balances reveal outcomes more clearly than daily behavior. The pattern exists long before anyone else can see it. Give me a minute because there's another layer that makes this cycle even more interesting. It has less to do with spending itself and more to do with identity. Over time, repeated behaviors begin shaping the way people see themselves because routines quietly become part of personal identity. What starts as an occasional choice gradually becomes just how I live. Once identity becomes connected to a routine, changing that routine can feel emotionally uncomfortable. The challenge no longer feels financial, it feels personal. That helps explain why lasting financial change rarely comes from willpower alone. It usually begins when awareness changes before behavior does. When people start recognizing repeated patterns without immediately judging themselves, they create space for better decisions to emerge naturally. Observation often comes before meaningful change. The hidden cycle isn't maintained by a lack of intelligence or ambition. It's maintained because familiar routines quietly become part of who we believe we are, and understanding that opens the door to a very different way of thinking. Once David understood the pattern, he stopped asking whether every purchase was worth the money. He began asking a quieter question about whether each recurring choice still reflected the life he wanted to build. That small shift changed the entire conversation because awareness replaced assumption. Habits that once felt invisible became visible simply because he started paying attention again. Here's what makes this important, because lasting financial progress rarely begins with dramatic changes. It often begins with noticing ordinary patterns before trying to change them. Imagine steering a ship across the ocean because even a slight adjustment in direction can gradually lead to a very different destination. The correction feels small at first, yet the distance grows with time. Financial decisions often work the same way because repeated choices quietly influence direction long before they create noticeable outcomes. Consistency shapes the path more than isolated moments. I know what you're thinking because this still sounds almost too simple. How can something so ordinary create such meaningful differences over time? The answer isn't that one purchase changes everything. It's that repeated decisions slowly establish the systems we eventually live inside. Systems are simply patterns repeated often enough to become predictable. Personal finances are no exception, because today's routines quietly become tomorrow's financial environment. History repeatedly shows that large outcomes often emerge from many small actions accumulated over long periods rather than one defining moment. Personal financial habits follow a remarkably similar principle. That's why awareness matters more than perfection, because perfection disappears quickly, while awareness can continue guiding future decisions. The goal isn't flawless behavior, but intentional behavior. Stay with me because there's one final idea that ties everything together. It explains why this hidden cycle can continue for years without feeling obvious. The brain doesn't wake up each morning trying to waste money. It wakes up trying to conserve mental energy by repeating what already feels familiar. That design helps us navigate daily life efficiently, yet it also reminds us that familiar routines deserve occasional review. The same shortcut that saves attention can quietly reduce reflection. Instead of asking whether a habit is expensive, try asking whether it's still intentional. That single question often reveals more than immediately searching for costs. When awareness returns, choices become visible again. And when choices become visible, thoughtful decisions become easier to make. David never found one dramatic moment where everything changed. He found dozens of ordinary moments that had quietly been shaping his financial life all along. The grocery store wasn't the beginning of the story after all. It was simply the first place where the hidden pattern became impossible for him to ignore. Most people won't recognize the cycle during one purchase because that's not how habits reveal themselves. They become visible only when many ordinary moments are viewed together. That perspective changes the way we think about money because it shifts attention away from isolated transactions and toward recurring systems. Patterns often explain more than individual decisions. Financial psychology isn't really about predicting the future. It's about understanding how today's repeated behaviors quietly influence tomorrow's possibilities. The hidden cycle loses much of its power once it becomes visible because awareness interrupts automatic repetition. The routine doesn't disappear overnight, but it no longer remains completely unnoticed. Perhaps the most valuable question isn't how much you spent this month. It's which recurring choices no longer feel like choices at all. That question has no universal answer because every person's priorities, responsibilities, and goals are different. What matters is recognizing whether your habits still reflect your intentions. Sometimes the biggest financial insight doesn't arrive through a complex strategy or a dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes it begins with noticing the ordinary things you've stopped noticing. The hidden cycle that drains money each month isn't usually hidden by mathematics. It's hidden by familiarity. And once you begin seeing the pattern, you may never look at everyday decisions in quite the same way again.